Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Always a pleasure to be in Barcelona. But I will say and a special pleasure to be in the school. I have not been here before, but your reputation precedes you. It's an incredible environment. In my quick touring around, the work you're doing is quite significant and exciting. And so to be part of this environment is a treat. It's also just an incredible space, a kind of real working factory, if you will. Now that has its good sides and its bad sides, I'm sure. But I really appreciate the invite and your ability to come. Let's see if we can get this working. There we go. I'm going to really pick up where Matilda left off with this idea of staging, right? So often, architects, for instance, will design a building, make a building, the building opens on day one, the photographs are made, and the architect walks away, right? And then the building does its function. I think in landscape, we are very much tuned in to the dynamics and processes that are already at work before us. And so the idea that we tap into those dynamics, that we alter those dynamics, and then that we acknowledge as soon as we step away, those dynamics will continue to play themselves out. This idea is very, very important and very critical to the work that we do. In that sense, our work really happens at these moments, and the life of the places evolve over time. And so this idea of staging, setting up, supporting, curating, catalyzing is very much essential to the work we do, and essential to the work we do at a multitude of scales. Conceptually and operationally, staging opens up possibilities for how we negotiate between the things we make and do, and the various ways that time, climatic and environmental processes, social and racial dynamics, social life and everyday activities, economics, regulatory systems, policies, and politics will continue to impact and remake the contexts and performances of our work. And so this talk will frame how we at STOS tackle these challenges vis-a-vis an ideas-based strategic design practice through the pursuit of critical social, cultural, and environmental agendas, and through a commitment to application and implementation. The talk parallels a recent project, Mise en Scène, a book collaboration with a photojournalist, Mike Bellamy. The book is not so much about foregrounding our work as it is about communicating to broader audiences the kind of issues that are in play in cities across America, as well as around the world today. It's a conversation about what we as designers encounter in our everyday work lives, and the lives and situations depicted here in the book, in many of the photographs and many of the black and white photographs that you'll see tonight, set the stage for the work we do in cities, just as our designs and projects set up new and altered conditions. And so what I want to do is address this idea of staging within three thematic groupings at three different scales: accommodating difference at the scale of the human body, reinaugurating dynamics at the scale of the site, and cultivating the city at the scale of the city or territory. And so we'll dive right in. This idea of accommodating difference is born from an interest in human behavior, recognizing difference in human bodies, in our different moods, in our different desires for setting, for context, for degree of sociability. Sometimes we want to be social with one another. Sometimes we just want to be a little bit apart from the action. It also is born from our innate tendencies to reappropriate the world in front of us, to encounter it as it is, and to make it our own. That's what's happening in this photograph you're seeing here. This is not a bunch of guys misusing the picnic tables and benches. They're just reappropriating it for whatever set of activities and social interactions they are involved in or that are playing out. It's also what's happening in Herman Hertzberger's photograph on the right-hand side, where these two ladies have chosen to squish their bodies in between these two parked cars to enjoy their lunch. And it's what's happening in the image on the left. Though I will say the folks in the image on the left are appropriating the world around them because of a lack of investment, deliberate lack of investment that has been made for them and in their environment. Skateboarders, of course, are quite good at reappropriating the world for other means. And I think, you know, we all have this tendency to just kind of do what we're going to do, even if the situation around us isn't necessarily conducive to what that activity might be. And so this whole idea of us moving through the world, reappropriating things, using the world to our own ends and means is at the heart of this part of the presentation. Kids, of course, are really good at doing this. My own kids would sort of walk on the sidewalk and hop between metal utility covers, making a game, not realizing that there's this incredible underworld beneath those metal lids. And so we began to play on this. How is it that we could take this idea of appropriation, the idea that we simply are tapping into people's curiosity within public environments, within the public realm, and just test how things might play themselves out. So this project, Safe Zone, was a very early study for us at a garden festival in Grand Métis, Quebec. And we used simple poured-in-place rubber to varying thicknesses, creating a topography that was just open-ended. It didn't tell you how to use it. It just offered itself to you. And kids were amazing at just kind of appropriating that space. They would create games, they would run, they would fall into one another. Adults sometimes required a cocktail in order to get themselves going. And it was a garden festival, so cocktails were offered. But it was amazing to see the construction manager for the project actually documented the space over and over again. And it was just amazing to see the different ways that people used a space like this. And so this interest in human behavior has translated into a number of projects for us. It's also translated into processes of making across both digital and analog design and fabrication. Here, the emphasis in these projects is on replicability and variation, on intensification of certain moments. Each, though, has a different formal expression, though all of them share a common set of interests. And I'll take you through a number of these. The first is from the Erie Street Plaza in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Here, our obsession was with the systematic, the idea that multiple parts, in this case, just 4 simple parts, can be combined in infinite ways to create different kinds of social groupings, different kinds of seating levels that accommodated bodies of different shapes and sizes. These seats could then be deployed differentially across an animated surface or field in order to create variation or intensification. These were very much analog explorations tuned to regional craft. Here we were working with a fiberglass manufacturer that typically made canoes, who was able to retool some of the machinery in his office to create these benches and lighting devices. But the idea was how to create variation and difference by a simple series of parts that could be combined, recombined, and deployed across a surface to begin to offer that variability. The same idea was manifest differently in the city deck in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where we were very much interested in both the individual and the collective, the infrastructural and the region. Here, scalar variation really went from the scale of the human body up to the scale, in this case, of the river. Here we were using systematized folded surfaces of wood, again, tapping into an idea of regional craft and the ability to use northern Wisconsin materials and northern Wisconsin carpenters. And here you begin to see how the scaling up offered social variation at the scale of the body, but also began to transform the entire waterfront along this downtown edge. Now, those were analog processes, but we were thinking in a kind of parametric way, if you will. And the next few projects really start to develop these forms and techniques using digital design technologies and digital fabrication technologies as well. At Harvard University, we were looking at integrating the design and fabrication process here using, in this case, different seating profiles scripted together across a single bench form and then multiplied across an open field. 7 distinct benches rearranged across this field, again, set up a whole series of different kinds of seating and social arrangements. And you can see in this one photograph the various ways that people would start to appropriate and reappropriate these seating devices. At the Venice High School in Los Angeles, a very, very simple, quite inexpensive version of this that really just flipped a single module in order to create variation, again, deploying these techniques across the field. A slightly more sophisticated version at Gierstacker Green at the University of Michigan, where we're interested in developing a system or a catalog of seat walls and benches and curb units that could be arranged and rearranged and deployed interchangeably in order to create a variety of conditions across the site. These individual units could be combined in different ways to create these different elevations. They would also begin to describe different plan geometries on the site and different three-dimensional and functional capacities. Here, there was an emphasis on smoothness, on seriality, on multiplicity, on variation. And we're trying to marry up this idea of conceptual thinking and techniques of generation and making. All of this is very much rooted in ideas of sociability and flexibility, the social ecologies of a place, and I'll come back to that idea in a few minutes. It's an approach that's less deterministic, it's more open-ended, and it affords choice, difference, and differentiation. Second, reinaugurating dynamics. The science of ecology tells us that the world is always in a state of interaction, of dynamic interrelationship between organisms and the environment, and by extension, between and among humans and non-humans, environmental processes, and the material stuff of the earth. And so how is it that we can recognize that our sites, our projects, the cities and spaces we work with and work in are already in a state of motion, with multiple histories and stories and processes in play, even if these have been momentarily muted, erased, or buried? How do we activate the latencies of a place in search of new integrated relationships and new dynamic futures? A very early project, Stockpile at Radcliffe College, emerged from an interest in simple material studies and their interaction with environmental, animal, and human processes and actions. This was a project that was conceived, designed, and installed in 3 days for a very temporary event that was taking place, but it remained in place for over a year and became a project that itself recorded change as the different materials began to settle according to their own different physical properties and according to the ways in which animals or students, sometimes stumbling through the garden at night, might make their impressions. This idea of process and recording change is very much at the heart of a number of the projects. Erie Plaza, again, in Milwaukee, the idea of reinaugurating hydrologic and environmental processes that were previously buried by infrastructure and industry, brought back to life with very simple manipulations of surface, of edge, and of grade, taking a flat site and folding it and stepping it down, allowing water to penetrate the surface and water to flow over the surface in ways that created new kinds of ecological opportunities that were quite similar to the conditions that preceded the infrastructure and industry that are now there. All of this was in support of ecological succession and social animation. And you can begin to see how this wetland of native species begins to change quite dramatically over time. And the idea that both time is marked both through the way that plant material expresses itself, but also by the way that the water will momentarily reoccupy space within the city. At Gearstacker Grove, this is a project that rethinks the traditional campus quadrangle as simply a setting for college buildings and a space for circulation and image making. This is a project that very much responds to new environmental demands, new social needs for students and for the academic community. Here again, we took a dead flat space, began to manipulate topography to create highs and lows, different opportunities for social gatherings and for ecological variation and diversity across the site. But in many ways, the heart of this project starts with the need to retain 95% of the stormwater that's falling on the site. Because this is a very clayey soil, water doesn't penetrate the ground. So we had to create very large retention basins, retention gardens here in order to contain the stormwater. And you can see those in blue on the plan scattered across the site. In this animation, you begin to see how those stormwater wetlands work. The idea that we could create a lush, biodiverse space, an excavation on the site that were animated by flickering lights. And here, the introduction of technology through the lighting allowed us to connect environmental processes to human experience. The more it rained, the more water entered those systems, the more dramatically these lights would begin to flicker. And so the more miserable it was outside, the more quickly you wanted to run through that space, the more beautiful the lighting effect would be. And so this idea of using technology to weave connections between our own humans' experience and what's going on around us in the world was very much at the heart of this project. And so all of these are projects that catalyze intentional hydrologic and ecological processes that initiate succession and adaptation, breathing new life into these spaces. Now, as I said earlier, these ideas are rooted in complex adaptive systems ecology. The idea that healthy ecosystems are designed to undergo dynamic change over time. These ecosystems are characterized by diversity and variability and the ability to adapt, right, to changing conditions. In this way, these kinds of systems that we're dealing with are open systems, open to the environment. They have internal mechanisms, but they really respond to what's going around them. I think these ideas can also be applied to social spaces as well. The idea that flexible, adaptable spaces really become healthier, more robust spaces within the life of a community. Spaces that can be open to unanticipated change as well as unanticipated uses and futures, encouraging appropriation and spontaneity within the urban environment. And at a different scale, the Plaza at Harvard does this partly through the way it scripts out or sets up the ability to stage different kinds of activities and events over time. The surface of this project is really quite simple, but what lies beneath the surface is what allows it to be animated. A series of tent foundations in various conditions, as well as utility plugins. The entire surface becomes a kind of plug and play that allows the university to set up different kinds of activities that might occupy the space in radically different ways, sometimes for very short durations, other times for extended durations. And so this idea that you can set up a public space to be programmed, to be changed, that we can begin to anticipate some of these events and activities, and yet leave it open so that others can decide, is what's at the heart of this kind of thinking. And allows for moments like this. I mean, that guy playing ping pong is having the time of his life in a space that was previously not designed to do this. And then the city. At the city and regional scales, things get even richer, but considerably more complicated. Here, the tensions between societal, racial, and environmental advancement and retreat, the battle for the hearts and minds of people, continue to play out in so many of today's public discussions, especially around new development, open space, and planning and design strategies in cities. How do we take on the most pressing climatic and environmental challenges? Who do we design for? How can a diversity of voices and cultures imprint themselves on the programming and design of the work that we do? This is where broader societal questions and battles, very much in play at the world at large as well, can inform and infuse our work. This also relates to my own starting point in landscape architecture, a starting point that really began with the city, not with horticulture. Frederick Law Olmsted in the 19th century, known as the father of American landscape architecture, began to develop parks and park systems that grew out of social reform efforts to clean up the city and make them healthier places for children, healthier places for the workers in these very dirty cities. And so the work is interesting in that way. It was meant to change the way cities work and change the way that people experienced life in the city itself. The work was also significant because it wasn't just about landscapes that were beautiful, landscapes that were functional from a recreational standpoint or from a habitat standpoint. These landscapes really did a lot of work. They integrated flood control. You can see from the construction drawing here how very much the Muddy River topography was altered through the design and construction of the project. You can also see rail tracks from light rail system that was integrated into the park. And as you look at the aerial photograph, you can begin to see the extent of parkways that wove their way through and around these parks and knitted them into the city. In all these ways, I think Olmsted's park systems were urban projects first and foremost. It wasn't just a park, it wasn't just an open space. They were doing a lot of different kinds of work. And so our own early work picked up on these tendencies. We looked at ecological systems as a starting point to build urban form here in Toronto on the lakefront, using the water of the Don River. And second, in Dallas, Texas, using stormwater resources that were being funneled through a site to begin to set up an opportunity to create water gardens and music gardens at the heart of a whole series of new urban neighborhoods. And so this idea that landscape processes, landscape systems can begin to transform the way that cities work is very much at the heart of this, and that there's a social agenda that can be woven into that is important as well. at the city deck, at the scale of the city, the idea was to activate this space, formerly an industrial site on the waterfront, to create opportunities for everyday events, everyday moments, but also to create a capacity to host civic events. All of this in a floodplain that required the space to operate uh, uh, in many, many different ways, right? So at certain moments in time, water could take over the space, the water would go away, different kinds of activities could begin to be hosted here or to play themselves out. And so the idea of multifunctional infrastructure at the heart of a city edge was very much in play in a project like this. Here we were integrating landscape and infrastructure, urban design in the public realm with ground floor building activation to create new social and collective civic activities on the riverfront. In Boston, we're working on a number of projects that deal with the impending effects of climate change, sea level rise, intensity and frequency of stormwater, as well as urban heat island effect, and questions of how those climate change effects are having impact disproportionately on certain populations across the city. On the one hand, sea levels are rising already and are projected to do so for many decades to come. Groundwater tables are also rising, and low-lying sites like Moakley Park cannot handle the increased volume of stormwater falling on sites today. So we've been commissioned to design a 90-acre waterfront park or redesign the park that's already there. This is a project that sits at a complexity of infrastructural and urban conditions. You can see the site labeled here with various flooding projections for how not only the park, but the various neighborhoods that are immediately adjacent to the park will be flooded over time, and how that flooding will spread out into critical infrastructure, public transit, and new development sites as well. So this park plays an incredible role in what happens to the various neighborhood and urban districts around it. You can see the park is also surrounded by a series of barriers, 6-lane roadways that actually prevent access to the park. It's highly underutilized, it's flat, it floods a lot, and mostly it's old baseball fields that aren't highly utilized. You can also begin to see the impacts of coastal flooding on neighborhoods that are immediately across the street. Those neighborhoods are public housing, some of the lowest income, most racially and ethnically diverse residents in the city of Boston. And so it's a project that very directly impacts the most socially and economically vulnerable of Boston's populations. And in this process, we've been engaging multiple design publics, multiple voices, allowing them to have influence to inform the way we program and design the project. So much of the work that we do in the public realm in the States is heavily influenced with public engagement. We like to use that in very proactive ways. We like to create a diversity of voices so that the input coming to a project like this is really radically diverse, right? We see an opportunity here to create an urban destination park on the one hand, but also to create a much better community park for the folks who live immediately across the street. Some of this comes through engagement. Some of this comes through testing different activities on the site. And we're quite diligent about collecting data. As of 2 years ago, we had 22,000 different pieces of input that were put into our database to begin to understand the different activities and programs that could be played out within the park. This was quite unique. We weren't necessarily given a brief by the city. for the kind of program that we were asked to create. We were asked to go and consult the community, and from that create a brief for the park of the future. And so with that, we were able to take this underutilized park with unsafe streets that regularly flooded with low biodiversity and create something that was both a civic destination park, a resiliency project, and something that really spoke to and responded to the very basic needs of people living across the street. The project itself has a number of different parts. The urban edge, the city edge, is programmed in such a way to almost be a linear series of activity spaces for folks who live immediately across the street. These are grouped typically by age, connected with an urban promenade, running and walking tracks, seating areas, etc. As you move into the park is organized around 4 sports rooms with very intensified edges. Here, topography is used to intensify the edges of those spaces for sledding opportunities and for a number of different other garden and social programs to start to inhabit those edges. These two are systematically developed as part of a language that occurs and recurs throughout the park. On the coastal edge, the idea of integrating flood protection into the coastal park is front and center, and to do this in a way that integrates those elements into a new kind of coastal landscape, one that's reminiscent of the New England coast on the one hand, but really creates a kind of urban or urbanity around a new kind of ecological community right within the heart of the city. The functioning of this space is quite important. On the one hand, it deals with stormwater, occasional stormwater flooding, and makes visible stormwater as it begins to fall on the park. As sea levels rise and coastal storms begin to inundate the park, the flood barriers integrated within this landscape as well. And so again, this becomes a multifunctional space that allows for that inundation, protects nearby residents, and then slowly over time allows that water to move away again. And so the project fits within a much bigger system within Boston. It begins to finish off Olmsted's Emerald Necklace, creating a linkage from that park system directly to the waterfront. But it begins to then radiate its own set of green networks back into the city, back into a set of neighborhoods that to date have been underserved. City projects as well. How is it in projects that we might build on the energies of people already in place in a city like Detroit? How do we begin to think about the way that music and art and food and sociability might become the basis for new forms of a landscape-based urbanism? How might we begin to create value simply by looking around at what people are already doing? Detroit, as you may know, was a city that shrunk quite considerably from almost 2 million to just over 600,000, leaving a wake of underutilized, even vacant lots and vacant areas of the city in place. We had an opportunity to go in there and just simply reimagine the ways in which these urban fabrics could be reutilized as we go forward. Oftentimes this dealt with, again, engaging processes that were already in play, allowing for ecological succession, choreographing hydrologies to create different kinds of biodiverse landscape spaces, but also beginning to put in play productive and cultivated landscapes that might allow for a different kind of social life in the city. So in this sense, investing in ways different than what normative economic investment might look like, but rooted in desires for social interaction, and rooted in around basic needs like food and water and clean air, as well as moments of power and beauty. In St. Louis, we were dealing here with a city very much reckoning with its past, a racially divided city. I think it's important to say in the US, racial politics and racial legacy is front and center right now. And how that plays out in a lot of the work that we do is one of the things that we're very intentionally taking on. In St. Louis, oftentimes it's about looking to the side or just off center to see things that are there and yet are often rendered invisible, to question who spaces are designed for and who they are not designed for, which histories might be amplified and valued in a search for common ground. St. Louis is an especially poignant place where the disparities between white and Black are highly pronounced. The differences between where investment happens and where investment doesn't happen. This project, which was really a Greenway project, began as a search for common ground, trying to find the commonalities among St. Louis residents, whether it's landscape or materiality, whether it's music or sport. But it was also about digging deeper, acknowledging some of the buried and harder histories, indigenous histories, hydrologic resources that have been buried, and some moments in the city's racial past that needed to be reckoned with. This project was about rescripting the history of the city, of finding those moments throughout the urban fabric that were meaningful to folks who were not white, to surface histories that weren't talked about, and to make those moments part of the everyday experience of the city. It wasn't done in a way to cast blame. It was simply done as a way to kind of recognize the diversity of people that were living and working across the city, and simultaneously to bring joy, moments of joy to everyday life. The Greenway, now known as the Brookline Greenway, was really a collaboration among an extensive team and artists of color council who actually helped us think through questions of materiality, questions of program, questions of social use. Our own set of artists began to develop a series of thematics that would undergird the project, no matter where it went. And all of these issues started to inform the location of the Greenway and the places and people it would begin to connect across the city. 20 miles of Greenway in total, really rescripting, rewriting the way that the city was organized from a social, cultural, and economic standpoint. And so this Greenway has many manifestations in the heart of downtown St. Louis, in underutilized places underneath infrastructure, all the way up to North St. Louis, home to the city's predominantly Black population. And this is one example of where we dove in, made an investment to connect to the Griot Museum of Black History in this case, but also to begin to make investments in the area immediately around that space to build a sense of community off of a cultural destination that was already known to that community, and to bring new life to that space. The short video, you begin to get a sense of the collection that's inside the museum. We wanted to bring that collection to more people, but to do it in a way, first by connecting people to it, then by extending some of the programming and social activity of that museum out into vacant and underutilized spaces immediately around it. And so this video takes you through a collection of elements the outdoor stoop for socialization, a whole series of gathering spaces, performance spaces, spaces that were open to that community being able to activate them, to play their music, to sell their wares, and to find their own way to develop community and social interaction within a rejuvenated urban environment. It had other elements as well, a kind of very open-ended toolkit for some of the hardest hits areas of the city with vacant lots. The idea that with our toolkit, any number of people might begin to curate or author, make decisions about which lots were put to use for which purposes. And so the idea that we can begin to create an organization or a system that then allows people to interact with that, and to allow them to allow the landscape evolution, to inform that landscape evolution, allow it to play out over time. And so a very simple set of plantings early on might give way to a different set of social activities over time, and may even then lead to other forms of economic investment within those neighborhoods. And then finally, a new kind of destination park at a real critical and difficult juncture of multiple highways. The idea of creating a space that would allow for the celebration of art and people, occupying spaces in ways that weren't currently occupied. Here we were collaborating with the architect Marlon Blackwell out of Fayetteville, Arkansas, on some of the infrastructure elements that were integrated into this piece of the project. All these, what you're seeing is an incredibly elaborate bridge on the one hand, but one that's following very, very simple principles of 5% slopes and accessibility that really then inform the way the pathways ascend and descend across this varied landscape and the various highways that are there. In all of this, I think the designer in many ways becomes a curator or a stage director of forms and processes that can be informed and cultivated by multiple publics over time. And so to wrap up, the stages on which we work, the actors we engage with, are already in motion when we arrive. Our work begins many acts in, and our appearances are sometimes relatively short. You might think of our work as understanding the scripts and dialogues as they are playing themselves out, interacting with those on stage and the forces behind the scenes in ways that both respond to and shift what is at work, resetting the trajectory of the play in ways that sometimes reveals what is hidden and giving new voice to those who have been off stage. Our approach involves recognizing and accommodating the everyday, often the mundane. We amplify the prosaic, the raw, the unrefined, the intimate, and the momentary, staging new futures to unfold of their own accord, all the while, hopefully, fostering the witty, the uncanny, and the truly wondrous. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Chris.
Sure.
It was lovely to see how you, through these projects, you've merged really this kind of social and ecological connectivity, allowing one to thrive off the other, feed off the other, and also make the other grow. I'm going to open up the possibility to our wonderful audience to ask some questions. We have the lovely Alicia Puleo, who has a microphone here. So if you would like to ask a question, please just raise your hand and she will come by with the mic. Anyone there? I will ask a question in the meantime then, warm the audience up. So one of the things that as I said before, I'm a huge fan of your work. But one of the things that it always kind of leaves me a little bit, well, I note is that when I see these projects, I think, wow, so much space, no? And one of the challenges that we're dealing with in Europe is that or particularly in Barcelona, but I would say in the European context in general, is this this complexity of dealing with incredibly compact spaces, no? So I know that you've been traveling through Europe at the moment, and you know the context very well. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on, or what do you think are the key learnings specifically from your experiences in the US in these kinds of contexts that we can really sort of apply straight off the bat in Europe? And what are the challenges that you'd like to really get your hands on in Europe, in the European context, to in some way evolve or challenge some of the principles that you've been sharing with us tonight?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I just arrived in Barcelona this morning, having been to the city a couple times in the past. I was struck not at how compact and tight it was. I was down on the beachfront, but actually how much space was created around the time of the Olympics in ways that don't feel nearly as crowded as typical European cities. That was quite striking, because most times we're thinking of density, right? We're thinking of the areas in the old quarter here, and how different uses, different people are sort of packed in one on top of the other. It's interesting that you say a lot of the projects are big. Some of the latter projects very much are large, but those earlier projects are quite small. One is a 1/4 acre. I'm not sure what that translates to here, but very, very, very tiny. The plaza at Harvard is just under 1 acre, right? And what we were trying to do in those projects, and also in something like Mobley Park, is actually pack too many things in to really intensify what might be going on there. And that's actually a lesson that I've learned from being in European spaces. The idea that spaces can radically shift from being quite open and quiet at certain moments to being highly intensified and activated at other moments in time. So that's me taking a kind of European learning experience back to the way that I think about public space in the States. I think your question really dealt with the opposite. How do we begin to take on some of the challenges that you face? I think the book project for us opens up very clear social and racial issues that are very specific to the United States. But those issues are very much present, I believe, in many countries around the world. They just play themselves out with people from different kinds of backgrounds. And so I would say there's thinking there about how we design in a way that's quite generous, how we tap into different cultural dimensions of people and allow that to begin to inform the work. That could be just simple traditions. It could be the things that people tell us are endemic to a certain place, or from their perspective, shared language, shared experience. And how do we begin to kind of weave that into a project like our own? I've got to say, it's now been about 5 or 6 years since I've been here. So it's time for me to spend a little bit more time on the ground and really figure out what's going on in order to properly answer that question.
We'll wait for the answer then.
Okay, I'll come back.
Okay, thank you very much for the lecture. So I have a question, and with a lot of these projects, especially the larger urban scale projects you did, they're really interesting. And what I would like to know is, how do you measure the success of those projects? Especially if you're tackling, for example, the problem in these more racial or where they have a lot of racial issues. How do you know afterwards if it solved something or if the project turned out the way you wanted to?
We have a couple ways of looking at things and figuring out in the way that you said it, were they successful or not, or how is it that they are working or not working, and how might they be tweaked, is the way that I would frame it. What was remarkable about the plaza at Harvard was that it's located just a half a block from where I teach, from where I met Danny. And I had the pleasure or not pleasure of being able to see it quite regularly. Had the pleasure of having my dean walk by it every single day as he went to school, and he would comment on it during construction, like, why does that thing look unfinished? And I'd say, because it's unfinished and you need to be patient with that. But it was quite remarkable. For a while, we had a construction camera up, and the construction camera was left on, and we could dial in and watch what was happening in the plaza, right? Some of the things we did in a space like that is actually test out different program configurations prior to construction in ways that allowed us to test different configurations that we could then design into the project. That's also what was happening at Mowgli Park. It's a test for us to see if something might work. It's also a test for people to see if they're interested in engaging in those sorts of activities. Sometimes it becomes proof of concept when you do it prior to construction. We do have the opportunity to go back to a lot of these sites and just watch, observe what people are doing. And the Harvard project, again, is remarkable because there was an entire team of people put in place to manage and program that space. And so they would learn, right, what to do, what not to do, where to put certain elements, where not to put certain elements. And then they would start to invent on their own. And that, to me, was the beauty of how that space evolved over time, because they were learning, they were adjusting, they were adapting, and people began to just do certain things. It was also quite remarkable within a couple weeks of that project opening. A gay wedding was held as a protest within the space, where the people involved just simply went around, gathered up all the chairs, and staged an actual wedding of two people within the space as a way to make a statement, right? And so it became something that wasn't just being programmed by the university, but people began to appropriate it for themselves. There are other ways that we can test success, but it's not so much for me about answering the question of whether the space or the project conforms to our preconceptions. It's, do some of the things that we're imagining might work within the space? Are they actually starting to work in the way that we imagine? But also, how are they starting to evolve? So does an ecological installation, right, really start to grow and adapt of its own accord? Have we set off the right set of processes to allow that to happen? And that's something that I'm looking for. It's not a predetermined outcome, but how is it that these processes are put into play? That's kind of where we're looking. The bigger question of what social racial problems it may be solving, I'm not going to claim to say these projects save the earth or solve all of our social racial problems. They don't, but they allow people to connect in different ways. If people see themselves in the project, it's one way that they make a connection, and they understand that that project's really been designed with and for them. So the very simple idea that the Artists of Color Council, in telling us that brick was an important endemic material to St. Louis, that brick became a material that was used within the project. And in fact, that when the Greenway was undergoing a name change, that it became the Brick Line, was something incredibly meaningful to them, because they simply saw their imprint being manifest in the project.
Hi, Chris.
Hello.
It's always a pleasure having you back in Barcelona, as you know. And to me, I have a kind of a reflection in terms of the difference, as she pointed out, between maybe Europe and or Barcelona in that case, and the States. No, I like very much to go there to see what's going on. And the fact is that the most difference that I see is how the role that plays the communities in the terms of the design of those projects.
Mhm.
That probably here it doesn't happen the same way.
Mhm.
Usually here, at least in Barcelona area, metropolitan, or more or less in the state, is that you got the competition, you win the competition, and then maybe later on you start to interact with the community.
Yep.
But in the States, the as you show and all those studios, always they show a lot of commitment and with the, as you pointed out, with the communities and how they can influence the project, how they really work, because there is a kind of relationship between the politics and the community, and to choose the right community is also very important in terms that the project goes further into the design process. So that relationship with the community, how does it work? Because I was, for example, last week in Chicago, and the community wanted to save like a tree in Inglewood, a community there, and they were very pushing towards that. But then Gensler, as you know, they wanted to raise it everything. So at the end, how does it work the community in terms of the projects in the States that we, for example, we are not that used to that?
Yeah.
We have to work on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So a couple of responses to that. We do have a legacy in the States of projects simply being imposed on communities. And in fact, in many cases, projects, highway projects in particular, be imposed on Black communities to remove them and destroy any sense of community that they have. So that a lot of the public process movement came out of reactions to those top-down planning processes. I think in the States, what then happened was you had one line of work that decided they really wanted to work with communities and work directly with communities in ways that communities would often then design the spaces that were in play. That's different than designers with a kind of cultural agenda, right? Designing a project. And oftentimes what happens in the States is community-based design is not about how the designer continues to kind of push a set of ideas, right? In conjunction with the communities that they're talking to. It ends up devolving into something where sometimes a designer is not even present, right? And so you have this radical split between what you could call high-level culturally ambitious design and community-based design, and there's nothing in between that. I think the work that we try to do under something that I'm trying to formulate as design publics is that as designers, we can have a number of cultural ambitions. We can take the training and expertise that we have as actors within a cultural realm and bring that to some of the challenges that we're seeing there, to bring that to communities that are struggling, that have certain needs that are met, right? That we can listen, that we can work with the communities, that we can develop things that are responsive to those communities, but that out of that comes something with a very high design ambition. And for me, that's a critical marriage, right? How is it that we maintain a kind of cultural agenda to the work that we do, but allow community voices and an increasing diversity of voices to begin to imprint that in really productive ways?
You just answered my question.
No, terrific.
But where do you find that courage? I find the whole presentation, the whole approach that you're showing very bold and almost conflicting to what we teach here, which is very technocratic,
Yeah.
data informed, do the analysis, desktop research, gather the
Yeah.
data.
Some of the things we do.
Some of the things we teach, of course. That's why I find it very bold. So you use evocative vocabulary, pictures,
Yeah.
emotion in the narrative.
Yeah.
Usually we use maps, graphs. You had in 159 slides, one slide with graphs.
Yeah.
22,000 people
Yeah.
collected. And you said
Yeah.
that whose opinion could potentially inform the plan.
Yeah.
Most likely didn't. We don't know.
No,
But
it did.
that would be
It
interesting
actually
to
quite
unravel
did.
that. It did.
Yeah.
So
In-
what's the role of this technocratic approach that we speak about so much here in your work?
Yeah.
And why is it hidden in this presentation? Because I find it sometimes it can be almost if technology has done its part, you should get out of the way.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
So much like planning, if it's done its part, it should be almost invisible. Just like what, as you showed us.
Yeah. I think it's there. I think sometimes, I mean, I think it's there, particularly in that first section, in the more abstract drawings that are really about how those parts and pieces are going together, right? I think it's there in moments. I'm going to pull up a slide like this, where the abstractions of the topography are being generated using some of the very same tools that you are all using to produce the models that I saw behind the curtain here, right? It's the same techniques, it's the same tools that we're using to begin to generate those forms. And then we have next to it, in this case, directly next to it, how is that manifest in the physical world, right? What does it look like? So I think all those tools are absolutely critical to how we work. They don't manifest themselves in this project so much, which is really tied very much to the mise en scène project, which was not a project intended to communicate to all of us. It's really intended to communicate to people beyond the design disciplines about the impact and import of what we do, right? How is it that we can engage the conditions that we're finding in cities today and use those as starting points for the work? So I think that's why you don't see it much in the presentation, but I assure you that it's very much behind much of the thinking. So the same kinds of investigatory mapping analysis is in there. There were a few maps, very carefully drawn maps that again come out of the book, but really intentionally look at overlaps between hydrologic systems, infrastructural systems, and the ways they define and structure the cities that were in question there.
Well, thank you for the talk. Hello.
Hi, I see you.
Okay. Well, should I? No, I'm fine here. Yes. Well, I just had a question. I really liked, particularly like the designs that you showed at first of all this furniture that changed to accommodate difference, as you say.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely very important if you want to include people in a space. But I was thinking also about another way of approaching this, which is maybe the capability of a designed object to be modified by the persons that interact with it.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I feel that you show this and at some point with the landscape projects, but I couldn't see it so much on the like more physical, small scale designs. And I was wondering if you ever worked with this kind of projects, and if not, yeah, if there's a reason.
Yeah, we would love to. And for us, the limitation often is the setting we're working in. So in a gallery space, to have something that would start to move and adjust according to weight, somebody's weight, or the way they push something or move something, would be actually a really good investigation. I want to use that for our next gallery installation. In the public environment, it's almost impossible to do that. I remember an instance on the High Line designed by Field Operations, right, where they had lounge chairs mounted on rails. And the idea was that those could be moved by people back and forth, very simply. Not a terribly sophisticated version of what you're talking about, but essentially would allow people to kind of move things around. There ended up being problems with people pinching their fingers or toes with the wheels and the rails and all that. So oftentimes in the public environment, it's really, really difficult to do those. And it's really, frankly, difficult to convince public clients to take on the liability for that. So I think what you're suggesting opens up a really interesting pathway for investigation, and I'd encourage you to do it. I'll take that back to the office and see what we can do too. But I think we just have to be cognizant of the kind of environment that we're working in. But I love for that. I love, even the way that it might react to an ambient or weather condition, as well as react to a person, could also be quite interesting as well.